Dr. John Gastil from Penn State University discusses the findings of his new book, Hope for Democracy: How Citizens Can Bring Reason Back into Politics.
About an election reform that was implemented in the state of Oregon, and why you should actually care about that quite a bit, because it actually gives you some reason to be optimistic. The present state of affairs is for many people a stressful one, because our minds are singularly focused on a presidential election. I hope that's not true for you, but it is true for many of your friends and colleagues who are kind of locked into this doom clock. I just copied this less than an hour ago. There's a bunch of these ticking down to the election. But what the presidential election unfortunately does to us is it tends to cause us to look on that election as politics. In fact, it's a piece of politics. It's a very unusual election. In some ways, it's distinct from all other elections. It's the only election you can't look away from. It bombards you with information. Most of the time, elections are much quieter, and you don't know the choices that you're going to make in the same intimate way. My co-author Katie Knobloch, quick shout out to Katie, we start the book by talking about this case, the monorail in Seattle. There's actually a whole series of votes on the monorail in Seattle until finally one stuck. And it was a proposal to create a new tax on new car purchases that would pay for an above ground train to transform Seattle's public transportation infrastructure. Now, I was on the winning side of this. I voted yes. And Seattle's quite a big city. This thing barely passed. Just a few hundred votes on the yes side made all the difference. And I don't know how rigorous the deliberation was, but I will confess, obviously I study deliberation and so on, but I'll confess I just loved the idea that the city would have the same thing that was in a Simpsons episode, the completely bad idea of a monorail in Springfield. I just couldn't help myself. I was singing monorail, monorail, monorail. Well, again, that was probably one of the more juvenile reasons for voting for it, but people were excited, and it was a complete disaster. The new car tax was easily circumvented, as the opponents of this measure had warned, by, you guessed it, simply buying your car outside of the Seattle city limits. Not that hard to do. This was quite punishing to local car dealerships. Meanwhile, millions of dollars were spent on designing the monorail, but without sufficient revenue coming in, it went nowhere. Literally not an inch of track was built. And finally, the tents were folded up after a ton of money had been thrown down the drain. Well, that's not that unusual, because elections on issues, as happens often on elections on candidates who aren't presidential candidates, are elections in which people don't really necessarily know really what the strongest arguments for and against are, what the real choice is. Now, this wasn't the first time that had happened. And the state of Oregon, sorry, a little slide panic there. The state of Oregon had the same problem. Every 2 years, they would have statewide ballot measures, and those would sometimes result in decisions that the public might come to later regret, or just never really fully understand the implications of voting yes or no on legislation. So the state was inspired to try a reform starting in 2009. The state capitol here was lobbied by these two young gentlemen, who were fortunately quite naive. They had recently gotten their master's degrees in public policy and thought, even though they both had experience as activists, hey, maybe we can just lobby the legislature. Is a good idea. This election reform, I'm going to tell you about, but I'm obviously holding you in suspense. And the legislators will just go for it. Well, long story short, they did. Now, these two guys weren't the only forces behind it. Ned Crosby, pictured in the center here, and Pat Ben, his wife, to his right, and Lynn Carson, an Australian deliberation scholar who photobombed this talk. These folks had pioneered ideas about deliberation to improve elections really since the 70s. And the idea of random selection, which, as it happens, Carson, our Australian colleague, had written about very early on, had developed to the point where there were some real ideas about how to incorporate random samples of the public into the electoral process. When it was finally implemented, what you get is a group of everyday citizens like this deliberating for several days on a piece of legislation. And in the book, Hope for Democracy, we tell the story of these young activists, these older designers and philanthropists, and the story of individual panelists, a couple women who participated in the first Citizens Initiative review, just to give you a sense of what this election reform really looks like from the vantage point of the people who either imagined it or actually lived it. All right, enough suspense. What is this election reform that these two public policy students were so excited about and that Ned Crosby and others had imagined and brought to life in Oregon? It's a surprisingly simple idea. First, a ballot measure qualifies when it gets enough signatures. That's the standard Oregon procedure. And when that happens, a commission decides whether or not the issue is important enough for the state that it requires a review. And if it does, then you get 20 to 24 citizens chosen at random to deliberate on that issue for a period of about 4 days. Step 2 is the actual deliberation. So during those days, this panel hears from people on both sides of the issue, along with neutral experts. They get to ask questions, have small group discussions, meet as a full group. What they're working toward during that deliberation is step 3, the creation of a statement that comes at the end of those 4 days. They write a one-page statement that tells you what they think are the key findings about this issue and the strongest pro and con arguments on either side. Now, this is written by that random sample of citizens. No staff or experts have any say in what they put in there. That then goes, and this is crucial, goes to every registered voter in the state of Oregon. Now, Oregon is one of the vote by mail states, as you've probably learned if you didn't know it. There are a few states that have voted by mail successfully for quite some time. Oregon mails out a full voter guide and a ballot separately for reasons I don't totally understand. And if you're a registered voter, you get those both in the mail. And in that voter's guide now in Oregon, in even numbered years, when the commission convenes a Citizens Initiative Review, or CIR, you get this one-page statement on, say, ballot measure 73 or 71 that has this analysis written by your fellow citizens. That's the simple idea, that to get information to citizens that they might find trustworthy, might find reliable, you really need to involve citizens themselves in the writing of that statement. You give them access to information, access to advocates on both sides, let them tell their fellow voters what they think they need to hear. Now, that's a great concept, but how does it work in practice? This slide here, I apologize, the slide's a little goofy on the scales, but you get the point. It ranges from strongly opposed to strongly favor. Yeah, it's the tabs that are off. This is driving me crazy, but I'll push through it. You get it from the left is strongly opposed, on the right is strongly favor, and at the top of the slide where all these little dots are sitting right now is where people are before the deliberation. The colors of the dots represent the ideology of the panelists as measured by surveys. I was part of a large survey team that studied this process for years, and people were very compliant, response rates of over 95%. If you want to have a high response rate, you should study people who have already responded to a solicitation to be randomly selected because they're ready to go. All right, so you see where folks are, right? Some conservatives, some liberals, and some independents. Now, what happens over the course of deliberation? If, in fact, deliberation can influence opinion, you should expect movement. And, in fact, that's what you get. There's a more dramatic movement of these dots if we're lucky here. There we go. Isn't that gorgeous? Over the course of a few days of deliberation, in this case, on this particular ballot measure, citizens came to believe that this mandatory minimum sentencing law was a disaster. How can you get people to move that far? How can you get conservative panelists to oppose mandatory minimums? Well, in this case, the mandatory minimums were both for repeat sex offenders of felony sexual crimes and for repeat drunk drivers, right? So far, so good, right? Conservatives, you want to be tough on crime. Well, as was pointed out by some of the critics, if a 16-year-old sends 2 explicit pictures of themselves to a 14-year-old, say at the same high school, that triggers the mandatory minimum of 20 plus years. That was not the intention. And the height of irony during this deliberation, the proponents of the law at one point said, in the very beginning, they said, of course, we have to put this on the ballot because the legislature can't be trusted. They're a bunch of bums. This law is fantastic. They don't know what's good for us. We do. So we trust you, the American or the Oregon people, right? And then in the course of the deliberation, they began telling the panel, well, of course, they don't trust them because they haven't had enough time to study this and they don't know what they're doing. So, whatever judgment they render is meaningless, right? They'd rather trust people who have only seconds to decide how to vote. And then finally, in the end, they say, well, okay, there are flaws in our law. We see that now, but you can trust the legislature to fix it after the fact. So that kind of muddled logic and weak arguments were really one of the reasons you saw this dramatic shift against this law. And this was the very first Citizens Initiative review. The second one was on medical marijuana and was interesting in that it came out very differently. It was almost an even split. And people did end up closer to their ideological predispositions in that case, but still wrote a really good statement that explained in plain language, you know, this is what you're choosing, right? You're choosing between this kind of an Oregon and that kind of an Oregon. So in both cases, the statement was very clear, the result of a good deliberation that was very satisfying to the participants. Now, this is from over the course of several years, so spoiler alert, this is not just the 2010 pilot, obviously it kept going. And the satisfaction levels for this deliberation were incredibly high, 95%. That's not unusual for these small random samples that are sometimes called mini publics, where people get to gather and deliberate. I mean, imagine how unusual this experience would be for you, right? It's a real rare treat to get to deliberate with fellow citizens on something of consequence. In this case, you know, heading right into an election. Think about the stakes. You really need to care about that statement you're writing because the state is going to mail it to every voter. That's powerful stuff. And again, if the process is good, it tends to result in these high levels of satisfaction. Well, with funding from the National Science Foundation, Katie Knobloch and I, the co-author of the book, we were able to do an extensive analysis of these initial Citizens Initiative reviews, present that to the legislature, and that with a lot of other testimony, got it passed as a permanent change to the electoral process. As you can see, there was bipartisan support for it, but everyone voting against it was a Republican. We can talk about this more in the Q&A, but just a hint, some Republicans are super concerned about anything that gets the government anywhere near public information. So even though the CIR Commission is an independent commission, they just were too nervous about the idea of the state of Oregon having any hand in creating any more information. A little bit ironic because if you think about the voter guide is literally written by state officials to some extent. So this is a little more independent than that, but nonetheless, that was one of the arguments. If you think it's maybe a financial thing, a curious fact about the Oregon CIR was that it's actually an unfunded program. It has to be funded by private money, philanthropy and so on, which is what's kept it going, but not every year. In fact, in 2018, there was no CIR because it had no funding. If you're wondering why the state would pass this with no funding, well, this was during a recession. If you do the math, right, 2010, 2011, these are tough times for state governments. We'll get back to that at the end of the talk, but anyway, those are a couple considerations here. And then finally, as I said, signed into law, 2011, and then it becomes a permanent part of the Oregon electoral process. Now, we've answered one question, which is, okay, could the citizens deliberate right in the middle of all this partisan, you know, politics? Yeah, they did a great job. They did a fantastic job. Didn't shock me or anyone who studies this at all. They wrote a very coherent statement the first time, second time, and so on. They've done a good job. There's no factual errors so far in any of these statements. I think they're a little bit muddled at times in terms of just the organization of the statements, and they've improved the process to have a little editing period where the citizens get to kind of form a little committee. Usually it's librarians, people like Karen who volunteer, and they make the statements a little more coherent, but still it's kind of A minus B plus work in my opinion. The statements are fine, but they could be better. But they're a lot better than the alternatives that voters have. Now, does that have any impact though, right? This whole thing is quite expensive. It's quite a production. When it goes into the actual voter's guide, it absolutely matters that it have a positive impact. And that's the second big research question that Katie and I looked at and we talk about in Hope for Democracy. So what you're seeing here is, and it's not important to see the text, the point is you see a summary of the measure written by the state of Oregon, estimate of fiscal impact, and then the text of the measure is in there as well. This stuff is pretty dry, it's pretty abstract, not super helpful to voters, as we'll see in a second. This is one of my favorite statistical slides. This is an experiment with 4 conditions. Yes, you only see 3. That's because I like to keep you in suspense. here are the first 3 experimental conditions. So this is a survey experiment. So if you can imagine yourself on the other end of a phone, we later did internet surveys, but this year it was a phone survey. And we're going to ask you how you're going to vote on this mandatory minimum sentencing law, which you know how the CIR panel came out. But these experimental conditions are such that they actually don't know anything about the Citizens Initiative Review. They don't even know that it happened in their state. It didn't get a lot of press, which again is why it's so important it goes in the official voter's guide. Media coverage is worthless in this case. But 4 experimental conditions. If you're in that first condition, you would experience me as the interviewer just asking you, how are you going to vote on the measure? There's no discussion of anything else, just how are you going to vote? And you can see roughly 2/3 of the people in that condition said, well, I'm going to vote for it. Tough on crime, baby. Oregon has voted to get tough on crime with this kind of law before. We'll do it again. Second experimental condition is just being a nerdy experimentalist. We want to make sure people aren't being changed by simply reading something. Maybe that activates them. Who knows? So they read a letter from the Secretary of State about what the party acronyms mean. Absolutely no relevance to the question that follows, and not shockingly, has no effect. The third experimental condition is more interesting because it's the official summary and fiscal impact statement, which you just saw a screenshot of a second ago. That doesn't have any impact on how people are going to vote, but it did have an impact on their confidence that they knew everything they needed to know in order to cast a well-informed vote. They became much more confident after reading that information, but it had no bearing whatsoever on their voting intention. Well, you know what the fourth experimental condition is. If you happen to be in that fourth group randomly assigned by our survey software, you would have seen or heard, in this case, read to you over the phone, the Citizens Initiative Review statement, and it would have blown your mind. When Katie and I got this result, we actually wiped our syntax, went back to the beginning, and started from the raw data set to make sure we hadn't cooked the books, because it almost looked like we had the data backwards. I mean, it was so good. But when we looked more closely, it was really interesting. Not only did this turn people against the ballot measure, but it did something subtle that we almost didn't see, which is when you're in these kinds of surveys, sometimes you tell the interviewer, I don't know, right? I don't know if I'd vote yes or no. And what does a good interviewer do? Come on. If you had to vote, would you lean yes? Do you lean, right? They nudge you. Well, a lot of people in this condition had to be nudged because we just blew their mind by giving them the statement and they didn't know. Right, they thought they were going to vote for it, right? You can imagine the same, same kind of people, right, randomly selected as anyone else in this experiment, but now they just heard something that contradicted that presumption. So if pushed, they would say, I guess I'm going to vote no. But that uncertainty is, if you think about it, kind of a positive thing, right? We could use a little more doubt and uncertainty in politics, not caused by crazy conspiracy nonsense, but caused by the exposure to information that might surprise you and make you reconsider. Now, it turns out that this is a hallmark of the Citizens Initiative Review is that it actually increases people's knowledge. What you're looking at here is a control group versus reading the statement across some ballot measures from 2014. A couple of years later, we did a bunch of these. And about a 10 to 15% knowledge gain is standard. What that means in practical terms is if we asked you 10 true-false questions, you might improve by about 1 or 2 questions on average. Some people more than others. There's another more wonky slide I deleted, but I'll tell you, really good news is the people who ideologically are the most wrong on these factual questions gain the most ground. They're the ones who correct the most. Now, there's very powerful theories in political science of motivated reasoning that would tell you that you should expect the opposite. People will absolutely resist information that contradicts their ideological biases. But there's another educational principle, which is the people who are the most biased in the wrong direction on a factual question actually have the most to gain by being exposed to new information, and that's what happens with the CIR. So it's a good example of how there's a level of trust in this information that can overcome those ideological biases and produce knowledge gains where they're needed the most, whether it's liberals or conservatives. They both hold some beliefs that just don't fit the facts, and they both tend to benefit from reading this statement. Another effect that I got to give credit to an undergraduate, in fact, our very first Nevins Fellow, a student named Brendan, in a car ride to a conference, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, he wondered whether reading the CIR statement would make a person more likely to vote. We don't have hard data on that. We don't actually know the voting patterns of the people in our surveys, but we did decide the next year to ask, hey, now that you've read this statement, would you be more or less likely to vote on this issue, or would it make no difference at all? And you can see for 60% of people, it makes no difference. But for a third, they say, actually, yeah, now I'm more likely to vote. If you didn't know it, people do tend to drop off as they fill out their ballot. They tend to kind of become unsure or lose interest and stop voting. So they turn in a ballot, but it's an incomplete ballot. Well, this is very encouraging, right? The left side of the slide shows you that in our experiments, we're getting this effect. The right side of the slide is actually people who had already read the statement before they took the survey, which ruined them for our experiment. But let us still ask them questions such as, well, you know, how did it make you feel about voting on the issue? And we got the same result roughly. So that's very encouraging that two different kinds of population were reporting the same tendency to become more likely to vote. And that's encouraging, obviously, because democracy, you want people to feel that they are, you know, able to. And the reason it's in Massachusetts is actually a recent undergrad from Brown University who got put on the legislative staff for a state legislator, and that legislator asks his legislative aides, hey, is there any issue that you're passionate about that you might want me to champion? And he said, yeah, I just wrote my senior honors thesis on deliberative democracy, and there's this thing in Oregon, and gosh, we should be doing this in Massachusetts because we have the same problem. And that legislator has been championing it ever since, and they've run a couple pilot tests, and indeed it may be that it will come to pass in Massachusetts. There is legislation pending. COVID kind of got in the way. You can see in California, Arizona, Colorado, and in Washington, various pilots have been tried, and now it's been tried in Finland and Switzerland. When I give this talk on the book, sometimes people ask, well, hey, could this be done at the national level in the US? Oh, we don't really vote on legislation at the national level in that same way, but Switzerland certainly does. So I wouldn't be shocked if Switzerland becomes the first nation to adopt this process, because the logic behind it is so simple, right? It's about citizens helping citizens make judgments about laws that are put on the ballot. It's not a small random sample telling people what to do, but it's giving us timely information that helps us make up our mind. And there's now, as you can see, a whole bunch of different issues that have been done with the Citizens Initiative Review, from casinos to genetically modified organisms, marijuana a couple times, hospital regulations, rent control, affordable housing, and so on. All kinds of tax laws and so on. And it's held up very well in all of these contexts. We can talk a little bit more about the details if you want to in the Q&A. If you're curious to know more about this, you can just Google Citizens Initiative Review. The Penn State Research website comes up quickly. You can read any of our publications, reports, and so on. Again, the point of this talk is just to give you a little bit of hope before the winter sets in, we're all indoors wondering what happened to our democracy. There you go. And we even got it in before Greg had to go to his Zoom. You're welcome, Greg.